Hello and welcome. My name's Irene Waldman. I'm with the St. Andrews Society, and today I'm very pleased to be introducing you to Craig Williams, who is a journalist based in Glasgow, Scotland. Craig, hello and welcome.
Hi, thank you. It's nice to be here.
Yeah, great to see you too. So today we're going to be talking about the late Queen Elizabeth II, who was our longest reigning monarch. And we're very interested to understand how the Queen was portrayed in Scotland. Can you maybe share a little bit about how Scotland is envisioning the Queen when she was alive?
It's been quite a strange time, and we've only just got round to doing this together a week after the funeral. And if you're following events in Britain over the last few days, you'll know that things have set back very, very quickly to sort of everyday events. There's a financial crisis going on. So it already feels like a very long time ago. But I think anyone who remembers it will remember it almost in the same sort of way that we'll look back and remember lockdown. It's like a 10-day period that was very different from anything that we'd expected or that we'd experienced before. I mean, as has been pointed out repeatedly, in order to have a very good memory of a coronation or the death of a monarch, what happens next leading up to a coronation, you have to be probably at least about 80 years old. So very few of us have experienced this. I can speak professionally because I'd worked on, as you have to do in broadcasting, you have to prepare obituaries and whatnot ahead of the deaths of famous people or notable people. And so I had worked on a half-hour documentary about the Queen a few years ago, about 3 years ago, which then sits on the shelf and you have to update it all the time. So that went out in the week after. So I'd spent a long time, about 3 years ago, thinking about this and about her relationship with Scotland. It was always joked about that, particularly in the public services and in the BBC and all these places, that the great fear was that she would pass away while she was in Scotland, because it just made it so much more different and complicated compared to had she died in Windsor Windsor Castle, where she'd spent most of the last few years. I think in the end, it ended up being a really interesting and probably in some ways quite positive thing in terms of people's reactions across the UK to it. She was held in enormous regard, and I think it's fair to say, the UK, the United Kingdom, is not yet anywhere near being a republican country. There remains a big majority in favour of the monarchy. And a great deal of that is probably, or was probably, tied to Queen Elizabeth II, which of course, I'm sure as all your history fan members will know, there's an issue there about Queen Elizabeth II, or whether she was that in Scotland, but we'll call her Queen Elizabeth. I think she was definitely held in enormous regard, and perhaps increasingly so over about the last 20 or so years. There was, if you go back 30 years to when you were still living in Britain, there was her famous Annus Horribilis, when the breakdown of two of her children's marriages, the fire at Windsor Castle, and she used that term in her Christmas Day address, that this was her Annus Horribilis. And that became a sort of a low point, I think, in the monarchy that was until the death of Princess Diana, which, of course, there was a great tide of public opinion appeared to be against the royal family about how it happened, because they were in Balmoral, they didn't come down to London for a few days. That turned around, I think, and I think partly because people were the very successful film The Queen actually kind of retold that story from a different point of view. But I think also the further people got away from the reaction and the behaviour post Diana's death, the more I think people felt a little bit embarrassed that it was maybe over the top and strangely demonstrative and un-British. Yeah. And therefore how the Queen had behaved then maybe spoke to an older generation, or spoke to what we regard as a different view of what Britishness is. So I think she had, over the last 20 to 25 years, become much more, even by those who would not regard themselves as monarchists, everyone would always caveat it with, however, the current Queen, and then go on to say something about her. So I think she was held in quite high regard over the last couple of decades, maybe more so than she had for the previous decade, a few decades before that, when there'd been kind of the modernization of Britain and the changes that both America and Britain went through from the 70s into the 80s into the 90s had maybe changed that relationship a bit. But certainly the outpouring of sentiment around her death showed you that this was someone who was held in incredible regard right across the UK. I mean, in terms of Scotland, so she died here. It had become increasingly more likely perhaps that would happen, because she really, really did appear to love Scotland and Balmoral. And now there are many different, as you know, there are many different Scotlands. In case the others don't know, you and I grew up and went to school together. So there's the Scotland that we knew in Edinburgh in the 1980s and 90s. I live in Glasgow, which is a much larger post-industrial city with a lot of the problems that brings with it. You have the southwest of the country, which is almost forgotten about by everyone, a very rural cut-off area. And then you have the Highlands, which are also very different from the Cairngorms and the part of the Highlands where she had the house at Balmoral. So her kind of understanding and the Scotland that she knew was very different than you would get from many people's ordinary lives. But she undoubtedly had an enormous affection. She loved the countryside up here. She loved Balmoral Castle. It was where she came every summer. Since she was a child. And of course, her mother was Scottish. Her mother grew up at Glamis Castle in Angus. I think it's in Angus. And was very much, and had bought, after the death of George VI in 1952, she bought the Castle of May up on the coast facing across from Orkney, actually. It's so far north that you can't really go much further north than the British mainland. She had bought that castle and used that as a place to recuperate and to sort of spend time and reflect after the death of her husband. So I think it's fair that Scotland, or the Scotland that she knew and understood, was very much woven into her life. And it became a kind of, particularly in journalistic circles and in political circles, it became, I think, known over the last decade or so, as much as you could know these things, that she was happy to be here, and that if she were to pass on when she was in Scotland, she would have been quite happy with that. That it was the part of the country that meant a great deal to her.
Yeah, it certainly seemed that she was spending a lot more of her time, when she wasn't working, she was spending more of her time at Balmoral. And in fact, I think I read something about when she returned to Buckingham Palace, that she hadn't actually lived there for, the last 2 years, really. Most of her time was either at Windsor Castle or at Balmoral. So there must have been something very special about Scotland and Balmoral for her.
I think so, yeah. I mean, there's always the traditional Christmases that they have at Sandringham. And I think there's a sort of element of they have to go to parts of the country that, they have links with and whatnot. I often wonder whether Sandringham was also quite because her father died at Sandringham, and I often wondered whether that meant the place had both a special tie for her, but also a sort of slightly sad kind of connection for her as well. Certainly, yes, lockdown, she spent largely at Windsor, and partly in a cottage in the estate. Of course, her husband, Philip, died just over a year before she did, about 16 months before she did. Everyone remembers it also became a huge political scandal subsequently. Her sitting by herself during lockdown at his funeral, and it was a very poignant picture. It said a great deal about her station in life by that stage where she was, but also the fact that she played by the rules, played by the laws around lockdown, and did her duty, which I think was a word that was used a lot in recent weeks. But so I believe that Windsor, had become largely the home, but certainly when she could, for the summer and for an increasingly longer section of time, she spent it at Balmoral. When she came to Scotland in the summer, and I've no doubt that this will continue with Charles III, the new king, that she has to go. There's the Royal Week at Holyrood House, or the Palace of Holyrood House, as it's properly known, in Edinburgh. But that's like Buckingham Palace. That's kind of the office. That is her official home in Scotland, or was her official home. It's now her son's official home in Scotland. But it's not the place that they go to relax. Balmoral was private to them. It had been bought by Queen Victoria after the death of Albert. It was a place for her to go and reflect and disappear and live a quieter life. And it does seem, by all accounts, I mean, there's always an element of spin in how organisations at the Royal Family, the Palace rather, is a very clever organisation in terms of its public relations. So there were occasionally films made showing their life there. But it does seem to be the case that, they walked more freely, they spent time more freely. There's Prince Philip's famous barbecues, much more private. It's a huge estate. I think it's about it's tens of thousands of acres. It's an enormous chunk of the country, and it is a very empty chunk of the country. You know, it's abutting the Cairngorm plateau. It's incredibly beautiful. I've only been up that way a couple of times. I must go and see it again because my son's just gone to university in Aberdeen, and I think I must use the example to try and go around that area a bit more, because it's stunning. And I remember one autumn day I drove over the Lech, as it's called, the road that bisects the area, and it's like nothing you've ever seen. It's picture postcard Scotland, because it's less wild and exposed. Well, it is quite exposed, but than the West Highlands, and less wet than the West Highlands.
Right.
So it's very rolling, but very, very rugged at the same time. And she was she was much loved in the town of Ballater, which is the local town there, where the church, Cratty Kirk, is nearby, and all the shops that sort of serviced Balmoral were based in Ballater. And there was a genuine connection there, I think. You know, it's very easy to be cynical about these things, but I think the connection between the locals and her family was very, very real.
What do you think that she enjoyed the most about the Scots that she would interact with? I mean, I heard that she used to go down Ballantyre and go in the butchers or wherever it was and just, you know, shop like a regular person.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a strange duality about the royals, isn't there? There's the job, essentially. You know, she has a role, and her son has that role as the head of state. Enormous amounts of fuss, crenellations, foo-fa, whatever you want to call it, that goes with that, and a huge amount of things that they have to go to. But there was also, you know, I think it was, you know, George V, her grandfather, was the one who kind of tried to bring down the excesses of a very Germanic royal family of the Victorian and Edward VII era, and make them much more, well, for them, English, really, to be honest, much more sort of middle class almost in the way they behaved and their personal behaviour. And that came down, you know, her father was not in line to be king. Well, he was in line to be king, but he wasn't the heir to the throne. So she was brought up in a townhouse in London and was, you know, educated in London until so she was in her teen years. And then, of course, her life changed in her 20s enormously after the abdication. Well, the abdication happened when she was about 8, but then her life changed enormously, of course, after that. But I think that she was, there were quotes all the time around after her death, and one was that, you know, she had seen herself as living a life of a country wife, as she put it, you know, not kind of terribly fashionable language or you know, the kind of language one would use today, but she saw herself as a country wife, someone who would very happily live in the country. So she loved horses. There's that great clip when some cows come into the stadium during I think it was the Olympics, the Commonwealth or whatever, and you see her go, "Oh, cows," and nudge Philip, because she's genuinely really loved animals, and she loved being out and about. She loved long walks. They loved picnics by the loch, probably one of the many lochs within the grounds. So I think she got to live the life of, you know, by our standards, by most people's standards, enormous privilege, but relative peace, privacy, and a kind of, if you like, a kind of country rhythm to how they lived their lives. You know, it was a very strange life, because she would have a piper at night time to walk around the grounds outside the castle and play a 15-minute bit of piping to sort of end the day. Which I suppose if you could have that, you would have that. Why wouldn't you? Yeah. But it must be. Guides. I wonder how far that would travel over those moorlands and the upper hills of that area. It must have been quite something, sound quite ghostly. Yeah. So I think that was the key to it. And I think, you know, you could always talk in terrible stereotypes about someone, but, you know, there is perhaps a more communitarian aspect to the Scots, a kind of less formal, less impressed by enormous wealth and privilege, and treat people as they are. You know, a man's a man for all that kind of thing. So I think there was a way she was treated, which would have been respectfully, of course, because, and you know, I presume for most people it must be like meeting a rock star. But I think at the same time there was a kind of genuine sort of mutual regard, but a modest kind of reaction from people around her in that part of the world, that she she seemed to like, that seemed to appeal to her.
She always kind of struck me as, being like the nation's granny in a sense, because she was old, but she was very charming. I think she was very loved by so many people of the nation. How do you think the Scottish population will remember her?
Well, Scotland's a very divided country politically. It's divided along the lines of, particularly the big political issue is the future of Scottish independence, or whether it remains part of the United Kingdom, which has been going on for a very long time and will continue to go on for a very long time and keeps lots of us journalists in business. And that's great, that's fine. But so you will tend to get, and Scotland is marginally more sort of left-leaning in its politics than other parts of the UK. Certainly at the moment, probably much more left-leaning than other parts of the UK, certainly England. Mm-hmm. So you've got a huge range of views, and there's no doubt about it. There are a lot of people, if you go by social media, saying fairly unpleasant things, which is probably never called for. It was equally easy for those of us who are not, who are not massively moved by the sort of the royal aspect of it, to not get involved with it terribly. You didn't have to watch it, you didn't have to listen to it, you could easily ignore it. But what's interesting is that there is no great move towards republicanism here either. The Scottish National Party, the SNP, the party of government in Scotland, were they to attain their wish for independence tomorrow, it would remain a constitutional monarchy. The independent Scotland would retain the monarch as the head of state. There's no move to get away from that. There are people probably within that movement, and the movement is wider than just the SNP, who would be Republicans, right. But that's not on the cards for any length of time at the moment. I think for the most part, people, I had one or two people in my private life and in my work life who were fairly phlegmatic about it all and fairly unimpressed and cheesed off by how much was being covered in it. But at the same time, my dad was who's in his 80s. He grew up in Wales in the 1930s and 40s. I was served in the Royal Navy for 11 years. He's fairly monarchist. He found it quite moving. He was, in fact, my dad, a couple of years ago, suffered a head injury. He was in hospital for 3 months. And he doesn't remember any of that period, but I have to tell him that all through the time that he was in hospital, the thing that he kept going on at me about was Harry and Meghan leaving and what they'd done to his Queen and Prince Philip. He was really exercised by this. He has no memory of anything of that period, and I have no idea why that stuck in his head, but it's certainly that he's no Harry and Meghan fan. But I think he is typical of a lot of other Scots of our parents' age and other ages who grew up where monarchy was something that was much more woven into the belief of what you saw yourself as part of a nation or a group of nations. And for them, I think it was a very sad moment, but at the same time, it was an interesting period to watch as well, the 10 days between her death and the funeral.
Yeah, it was pretty big. Like even in America, we, canceled meetings, stopped all forms of official business, that was certainly anything to do with any Scottish or British societies, all came to a full stop for the whole 10 days. Yeah. And in fact, I personally stayed up all night long watching the funeral live. I was amazed at the amount of walking that the royal family did, and certainly Princess Anne as well. I mean, she really stepped up to the occasion, you could say. I mean, just a lot of walking everywhere. It was very impactful to watch, I think. Yeah. Are there any moments that stand out to you as special moments from the funeral that either were unique or
certainly over the 10 days there were. I mean, I think we'll all remember where we were when we found out, but being a journalist, I was in an edit suite finishing the programme that I've just been working on, and it became aware across the course of the day, and this was different this time. It'd only been 2 days since she'd just met the new Prime Minister at Balmoral and shook hands. Then it was announced that she wasn't doing the Privy Council meeting the next day. And then overnight, it became clear there was something wrong. And the doctors said that they were concerned for her health. That was probably about midday. The black ties went on screen. You'll have noticed that with our main presenters and whatnot. You noticed a definite change in the approach, and I was still in the edit suite at about 6:30 at night, and my colleague, who's a political correspondent, picked up her phone and said, "Oh, she's died." And so we put the news on and watched. So I always remember that moment. for me, the standout, and it's a very strange memory, which again, like all these things, forgive me for mentioning family, but these things are always tied in with that, I think, when these things happen. That weekend, the Saturday, my wife and I drove up with my son to Aberdeen University to drop him off. That's him leaving home. We only have one child, so it was a big weekend for us. And it's about a 3-hour drive from Glasgow to Aberdeen. It was a beautiful day. And we dropped him off, we left him there, didn't hang around, came back, had a meal overnight, blah, 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 back home. And then the next day I did watch, and I thought this was the outstanding thing in terms of how it was all organised and how it looked, for Scottish terms anyway, was the move bringing her body from Balmoral down through Ballater, across to the road that we'd just driven the day before, all the way down the A90 to Edinburgh. That was quite remarkable. Apart from the fact that, as you say, poor Princess Anne had to sit there for 5 hours because it was done at a fairly slow pace, and lots of people out in the way. And parts of Edinburgh that you know as well as I, it came in through the Queensferry Road and through Blackhall into the city centre. So I know a lot of people that went to go and see it, and why wouldn't you? I don't think you would have to be a huge monarchist to be there. You're just going to see something historically interesting. So there's a big crowd out to see that. And just when she arrived at Palace of Holyrood House, I thought that looked fantastic. I think I put it on Facebook whether you saw it or not, but a photograph of Holyrood House, this grey stone building that's hundreds of years old, it's 500 years old, sitting under a lowering Scottish sky with the crags of Salisbury Crags behind it in Edinburgh. And I think they would have been, I don't know who I think they were from the Royal Regiment of Scotland and the the Company of Archers, who are her bodyguard in Scotland, bringing her coffin out and into Holyrood House. That looked pretty fantastic. I don't mean to be glib about it, but you did look at that and think, wow, that's quite something. The way it was arranged, the way they did it, the kind of tone of it. It couldn't have been any more Scottish. And then over the 3 days or so, I think she was in Scotland until the Monday, till the Tuesday, I think. I can't quite remember the days now, all measured to one. But her body was brought to light, not at state, it was made clear, because I think there's a particular reason for that. She was laid to rest at the Kirk of St Giles Cathedral in Edinburgh, which is a hugely historic building. It's the Grand Kirk of the Church of Scotland. It's where the Covenanters began. It's got an enormous, John Knox preached there. It's got enormous historical significance in Scotland. And it's, as you know, I'm sure anyone who's been there will know, it's none more Scottish. It's right in the heart of the Royal Mile. A beautiful but small, kind of in that Scottish way, very informal Church of Scotland building. And she lay there for 3 days, and thousands of people queued all the way up through Edinburgh up towards the meadows and whatnot to see her. But, that was pretty remarkable to see that. And it was quite interesting seeing people from England tweeting, I thought everyone up there hated us and things like that, or hated Britain. And that's not true, even among those who wish to be independent. It by no means is it a sort of a uniformly, we hate the other parts of the UK, would be apart from it. It's not like that at all for many, many, many people. But I think it did certainly, I think, speak to people from other parts of the UK that made Scotland feel much more part of it to them than it might have been for some time, when the last 20 years or so has been a kind of narrative of the two parts moving apart from each other. Whether that continues, I don't know. But certainly for that week, I think it reminded people that there is still an awful lot that the nations all have in common. Yeah. And that there was a very Scottish feel to that. It very much reflected the Scottish side to her character and that part of her monarchy. And
I thought that too, even just with all the bagpipes and the kilts and just, it was very Scottish. And of course the architecture that was surrounding the Queen as well. So Craig, just in closing, because this has been so informative and of course interesting, when Americans are going over to Scotland, where would you recommend that they go to either be connected to royalty in Scotland, or just some places that you think they absolutely need to go and visit?
There are so many, and it's a great thing if you're traveling around Scotland, almost every corner of it, you can do this. If you go to Edinburgh, you can visit the Royal Yacht Britannia, which was the Royal Family's yacht for about 40 or so years. That's down at Leith. It's been berthed there for more than 20 years now. It's really interesting. It's got a very sort of 70s vibe inside it. It's kind of modernised a lot in the 70s, so it's quite unusual to see. And again, apart from the great staterooms, you also see the kind of much more informal rooms where they stayed when they travelled abroad on the yacht. In terms of, I think if you want to relive what you saw during that week, you should visit St. Giles, but it's worth revisiting at any point.
Yeah.
Holyrood House is very much worth visiting. It also has a very good collection of paintings now, and a gallery at the side of it, the Queen's Gallery, which had an enormous collection of art from all over the world. That's really, Holyrood House is a great place to visit. But definitely go, Balmoral is open for much of the year. You can go there, you can walk in the grounds, you have a right to walk through it. I think you can visit the house at times of the year. You can go and stay in a guest house at the Castle of May, which was her mum's house. Glamis is always worth a visit. It apparently has a ghost of a woman with her tongue torn out, according to legend. But a really great place to visit, and I only visited it for the first time a couple of years ago, is Dumfries House down in Ayrshire.
Yes.
Which is actually, it's really her son's doing. He brought it back. He worked very, very hard, King Charles as he is now, to bring Dumfries House back from absolute pretty much ruin. And it now, in the same sort of model as with his own estate at Highgrove, it now employs about 300 people in an area that had been devastated by the loss of the mining industry. It's a beautiful house. It's full of amazing stuff. And it has a really royal connection through the new king now. So you could go, I think, to remember the Queen, go to Balmoral, go to Holyrood House. To touch upon the new king, go and have a look at Dumfries House, because a lot of it's done in his interest in environmental issues and sustainable issues, while at the same time being an absolutely stunning place to visit.
That's wonderful. Well, Craig Williams, thank you so much for your time here today. It's been an absolute pleasure to just talk with you, and I really appreciate your time. Thank you.
That's very kind. Thank you very much. Take care.